In Clash Royale, spells have always been the tools of precision. Whether it's control, damage, or utility, they exist to shape the battlefield, to bring order to the madness. But what if one spell did the exact opposite? What if instead of solving the problem, it became one? Enter the Goblin Curse, a spell so unpredictable, so chaotic. It didn't just change the game, it threw it off the rails completely. Here is the history of Clash Royale's most chaotic spell. It's April of 2024, and Clash Royale has just announced the way too strong Dagger Duchess. The meta feels stale, and with every new evolution, the player base grows more and more frustrated. But something green is lurking beyond the horizon. In June, we would receive the Goblin Queen update, and leading to this massive update, the game began teasing us with series of goblin-related evolutions. In May, we got the evolution for Goblin Barrel. Then, in June, two evolutions dropped at once, the Evo Goblin Giant and the Evo Goblin Drill. On June 17th, the full update was revealed, and with it came an entirely new trophy road, the Goblin Queen's Journey. In this event mode, spending 20 elixir on goblin cards would cause your Goblin Queen to fire a swarm of baby goblins onto the enemy side of the arena. A funny little gimmick for sure, but that wasn't all.
Literally shoots babies.
It's a new Tower Troop card that can only be played in this new Goblin Queen's Journey mode.
Specifically only on this mode. It's a whole ladder mode where you can collect all of the cards and push your way up to Goblin Road.
I think the way it works is when you play a Goblin card, it charges up. Then once it's fully charged, then the next time you drop a Goblin card, it activates.
We also got 3 brand new cards, the Goblin Demolisher, the Goblin Machine, and the Goblin Curse. And all 3 of them, they were ridiculously strong right out of the gate. Despite all of them being powerful, it was the Goblin Machine that stole the spotlight for most players, and honestly, that made sense. The Goblin Machine was arguably the most broken card we've ever seen on release. It could tear through nearly any defense with absurd barrages of rockets, dealing massive damage to both troops and buildings alike. But with the Goblin Machine dominating arenas, most players overlooked just how strong the Goblin Curse truly was. At launch, the Goblin Curse had a radius of 4 tiles, big enough to cover a large portion of the battlefield, easily transforming multiple troops into goblins, but that wasn't what made it so dangerous. The real threat was the damage amplification.
Did you know that Goblin Curse has damage amplification? And that's why we're playing Evolved Battle Ram, Evolved Hunter, Cycle Rage, Goblin Curse.
So on release, the Goblin Curse gave your troops and buildings a 50% damage boost against enemy units affected by the spell. If that wasn't already crazy for just 2 elixir, remember this: every enemy troop taken down within that area would transform into your goblins. The impact on the game was immediate and honestly kinda terrifying. In just a matter of days, Goblin Curse went from weird new card to why is this thing in every single match? It wasn't just strong, it was ridiculously versatile. Players started slotting it into every deck imaginable. Bait decks, control decks, and even beatdown decks with Giant and Golem, and unlike most spells, this one didn't feel situational at all. Sure, the goblin spawning gimmick was flashy, turn a swarm into free troops, that's already deadly. But what made the Goblin Curse truly dangerous was that 50% damage amplification. Even if it didn't turn a single troop into a goblin, that bonus alone was game-changing. A musketeer under the effects of Goblin Curse could melt mini tanks in seconds. A mega minion could suddenly delete support troops with a single swing. Even a cheap ice spirit jumping in the cursed zone could deal way more damage than it had any right to. It turned ordinary interactions into complete blowouts. Units that would normally trade evenly now came out on top and spawned goblins while doing it. And because the spell only cost 2 elixir, it was almost never a bad play. Whether you were pushing, defending, or even just trying to squeeze out a little more value from a dying troop, Goblin Curse always seemed to deliver. It didn't matter if you were up against a tank push or a swarm-heavy cycle deck, the spell just worked, and that's what made it so terrifying. You didn't need to build a deck around it, you didn't need to wait for the perfect situation. Goblin Curse was always useful, always annoying, and always just one good interaction away from taking over the match. And if you thought it couldn't get more ridiculous, it did. It was also the perfect counter to Graveyard. But before I show you how busted the Goblin Curse was at countering Graveyard, I want to ask to check if you're, subscribed to the channel. These videos take a lot of time and a lot of effort to make, and subscribing really would mean the world to me. Thank you. Anyway, normally players rely on poison to shut down Graveyard's skeleton swarm for elixir well spent to deny nearly all damage. But now, for just 2 elixir, Goblin Curse could do the exact same job. It wiped out the skeletons faster, gave your defending troops a damage buff, and then rewarded you by turning every killed skeleton into a friendly goblin. You didn't just stop the push, you ended up with a full-on counterattack for half the cost of poison. It was clear the cards were too strong, and Supercell luckily came through with an emergency nerf. Only a few days later, both the Goblin Machine and Goblin Curse were hit. For Goblin Curse, the 50% damage amplification was dropped to 35%. It could still help your troops and towers take out enemy units faster, but not as fast as before. On paper, it seemed like a fair adjustment, keeping the card useful but not broken. And for a moment, things felt a little more balanced. The card didn't feel like an instant win anymore, but as time passed, it became clear that the nerf hadn't really solved the core issue. It had only dulled the edges. Even with 35% damage amplification, the Goblin Curse still offered way too much for just 2 elixir. It didn't matter which matchup you were in or what troops you were running, if you dropped it in the middle of a push, it always gave you value. Then came early July, with the spell still popping up constantly and win rates staying high. Supercell made a second move, one that hit much harder. This time the spell's radius was reduced from 4 tiles down to 3, and the damage amplification dropped again, all the way down to 20%, and this update changed everything. That big 4-tile area that used to effortlessly cover entire pushes, gone. Now you had to be precise, miss even by a tile, and the spell might affect only 1 unit or miss entirely. And while the extra 20% damage still sounds useful, it just didn't compare to the oppressive 35 or 50% versions from before. Sure, your towers and troops could clean things up a bit faster, but the spell was no longer turning fights on its own. Most noticeably, it stopped being a reliable answer to, well, literally everything. Before, you could throw it out in almost any situation against tanks, mid-sized threats, or swarms, and it would pay off. Now it wasn't nearly as effective against beefier units. A 20% boost just wasn't enough to quickly burn through cards like Mega Knight, Giant, or Electro Giant. Suddenly, Goblin Curse wasn't helping you delete big threats. It mostly was just shaving off a bit of damage, and only if you timed it well. That shift completely redefined its role in the game. The Goblin Curse went from being an every situation card to something much more narrow. It became more clearly geared towards swarm control. Against skeleton armies, goblin gangs, or minion hordes, it could still be deadly. Your tower and your troops would clean up faster, and you'd end up with a pile of bonus goblins marching the other way. But beyond that, its impact was limited. And that's when people really started to feel how situational the card became. It wasn't just that it did less damage, it was that you couldn't really rely on it anymore unless your opponent gave you the perfect setup. If they were running tank-heavy decks or splash-heavy control, the curse often felt like a dead card in your hand. And if your own deck wasn't built to enable the spell, if it lacked swarm units or quick-reacting troops, you couldn't really take advantage of its effect either. The card went from being a universal threat to a highly dependent tool. It no longer guaranteed value, and it no longer swung games on its own. In fact, in many matchups, it barely made a difference at all. What once felt like a spell that defined the meta was suddenly something players thought twice about including in their decks, and unlike before, Goblin Curse no longer fit easily into every archetype. It wasn't a natural choice for fast cycle decks, which moved too quickly to set up the kind of value trades Curse relied on. It required more setup, more timing, and more dependency on your opponent playing into it. Instead of supporting your deck, the spell now demanded that your deck support it, which in a high-speed meta is often a death sentence. It was a steep fall for a card that had once looked completely busted, but this second nerf brought the Goblin Curse in line, and not just statistically, but philosophically. It was no longer a chaotic powerhouse, it was a niche utility spell, one that could shine in the right moment but would still often sit quietly in your cycle, waiting for its one chance to matter. And in a way, that's kind of fitting. The Goblin Curse began as pure chaos, turning fights upside down, swarming the board, and redefining how players thought about spells in Clash Royale. But after its meteoric rise and back-to-back nerfs, it didn't just fall out of the meta, it faded from memory. Once praised as a 2-elixir cheat code, it became something you rarely saw, even in mid-ladder. The nerfs didn't just tone it down, they changed its entire identity. What had been a universal value spell was now deeply dependent on the matchup, the timing, and the deck. With its radius cut to 3 tiles and the damage amplification reduced to just 20%, the Goblin Curse could not find the same value it once did. Suddenly, you needed the stars to align just to justify playing it. It wasn't the kind of spell you tossed out for free advantage anymore. Now it demanded setup, commitment, and most importantly, luck. And as its damage boosts shrunk, its role in the game became harder to define. It didn't control space like Poison, it didn't provide the clutch utility of Snowball, or the instant threat clear of Log. Instead, it existed in a weird middle ground, not quite control, not quite support, not quite synergy. It didn't replace any spell in a deck, it just felt like a weird addition that didn't always justify its slot. That led to its slow exile. Players didn't rage about Goblin Curse anymore, they just stopped talking about it. Decks that had experimented with it began reverting back to tried and true spells. And once the hype around the Goblin Queen update died down, so did the curiosity about the card's potential. By the end of July, the Goblin Curse wasn't a bad card, but it was clearly outclassed. Against tanky units, the lower damage amplification wasn't enough to matter. Against swarmy decks, its smaller radius made it hard to cover everything. And the once deadly Goblin Spawn effect became more of a nice bonus than a win con. The spell that once turned fights upside down was now only useful in very specific setups, and that kind of narrow utility just doesn't work in a game where flexibility is key. In many ways, the Goblin Curse went from overwhelming to underwhelming overnight. Not because its numbers were awful, but because the game simply didn't give it room to shine anymore. Fast forward a few months to October, and the Goblin Curse receives a buff. It was given a 20% increase in damage, so not a damage amplification increase, but the damage of the Goblin Curse itself. Now, 20% might seem like a lot, but the Goblin Curse's damage was already so low that 20% barely did anything.
All these goblins on top of the tower, bro! We just took the tower!
All it really did was make it so that bats and skeletons will now die in one less tick. In this video, we see Boss play the new buffed curse, if you can even call it that. Boss also says that he saw a few people in the top 200 use the Goblin Curse and wanted to try it himself. So let's take a look at this play he makes here.
Problem is, he actually is very likely to get our tower. We actually gotta be very cautious. I actually don't know if we should go for the King Tower or the Arena Tower here. The good news is he is gonna have to Lightning to take my tower, which I feel like is pretty bad for him, considering it's a lot of Elixir. And then I don't know how he's gonna defend after doing... Wait, is he even gonna be able to get the Lightning off? He might not have enough Elixir. Oh, he had to defend. He was not able to get that Lightning off. Wow.
Boss also confirms that the curse is actually pretty strong when the enemy player is running swarm cards like bats or skellies.
The tower, bro, we just took the tower off of that push. What the heck? The curse is actually really solid when they have bats or spear goblins.
But here's the thing, even though Boss makes it look solid, he's combining it with Rage to instantly turn those troops into goblins, and that synergy, it wasn't new. That combo had already been possible months before the October buff. Rage combined with the damage amplification from the curse deals enough damage to turn most swarm troops into goblins, even minions. The opponent really didn't have a chance to react. It was a clever interaction, but one that already existed. The buff didn't unlock this combo, it just reminded players that it was there. So in reality, this buff didn't give the Goblin Curse any new power. What it did give it though was visibility. When a card gets even a small change, it starts to re-enter players' minds. They begin testing it out again, theory crafting, and looking for new ways to make it work. It's like dusting off an old toy you found in your closet. You know it hasn't changed much, but suddenly you're interested in it again. The truth is, this 20% damage buff was more of a marketing bump than a real buff. It didn't fix the card's biggest problems, it was still too dependent on what your opponent played, still struggled to gain value against beefy units, and still required very specific timing or support to really pop off. But because players like Boss showcased it in flashy, high-pressure situations, it created the illusion that Goblin Curse was so back. And in a way it was, just not because of the numbers. It was because people gave it another shot, and sometimes in a constantly shifting meta, that's all a card needs to climb back from obscurity, even if only for a short while.
Guard, there's no way he's gonna fall for it, right? Well, what if we get a curse going here? Oh no, I don't think we're gonna get it. Wait, we got the, oh no. Oh, nah, that was so close. I mean, not really, but kind of close. I don't know.
Something interesting about the Goblin Curse is that it can't really be used independently. Unlike most spell cards in Clash Royale, which are designed to be standalone answers, Fireball to clear out cards like Barbarians or Musketeer, and Zap to reset Sparky or instantly take out swarms, the Goblin Curse tends to feel awkward on its own. Sure, you can throw it at a skeleton army, but what ends up happening is each skeleton that gets turned into a goblin just instantly dies to the remaining skeletons. It is clunky, it is inefficient, and it doesn't feel clean. You spend 2 elixir for something that could end up being a tempo loss. However, that's where the uniqueness of this spell really shines though. Goblin Curse almost requires synergy. To get real value out of it, you typically need to pair it with something like Zap, Snowball, or Rage. Now what happens is pretty interesting. That 20% damage amplification from Goblin Curse allows these spells to deal more damage. On their own, Zap, Snowball, and Rage can't take out minions, and the Goblin Curse itself doesn't kill minions either. But paired together, that extra damage boost makes it possible to instantly delete goblins and even minions with a low-cost spell. And in return, you don't just get a clean board, you get some goblins. It's almost like you dropped a Zap and a Rage at the same time to clear out a swarm, but for the same amount of elixir, you end up with a bunch of goblins that will most likely catch your opponent off guard. That's a level of efficiency and upside that no other spell offers. But at the same time, that's also its weakness. Because on its own, the Goblin Curse just isn't worth using, especially when far more consistent spells exist that bring guaranteed impact. A poison dropped onto a push will always get some value. A fireball is always a safe bet against medium-sized threats. Even something like arrows has clear, universal utility. The Goblin Curse, by contrast, demands a setup. It doesn't just need the right pairing in your own deck, it also needs your opponent to play the kind of troops it is designed to counter. And that's what makes it incredibly unique. It's not a plug-and-play spell, it doesn't dominate on its own, but when it's used at the perfect moment paired with the right support and against the right enemy troops, it doesn't just clean up the field, it completely turns it in your favor. It's one of the rare cards in Clash Royale where timing, synergy, and matchup all matter just as much as the elixir you spend. It might not be the most reliable spell, but when it pops off, it's one of the most satisfying interactions in the entire game. This also means that it is very meta-dependent. If logbait decks are getting very popular again, or if a card like Skeleton Army gets an evolution that is very strong, Goblin Curse is almost bound to thrive.
You know, just curse some that and could do pretty good. I'm gonna get the curse right here just to help us take out this RG, take out the ghost as well, and I think that's actually pretty good. Wow. Wow, that Goblin Curse actually destroyed that.
Fuck this guy, let's just do this, man. This is gonna be so many goblins, it's so worth it. Look at that, and that's what I'm talking about. That's fucking crazy. And that's why this strategy, I think that's the main attack. I think everything else is kind of a distraction waiting for that kind of play. besides a Inferno. Oh, that's it. So just go with this, and Evolve Bomb will win me the game. Beautiful work.
As we just discussed, the Goblin Curse is quite dependent on other spells, and this is actually intended as it was somewhat confirmed by one of the Clash Royale artists. But here's something very interesting that Abdad discusses, which I actually completely agree with. So despite the smart design, the card has a massive flaw. Because of how the curse mechanic works, players often hold on to it for the entire match and use it as a surprise factor, similar to how freeze is used. It encourages people to not play it at all until the very end, just to suddenly drop it on your tower and win the game out of nowhere. It punishes good gameplay, because even if you're ahead the entire match, Goblin Curse can steal the win unfairly. And since your opponent never plays it beforehand, there is no way to prepare or counter it. It feels cheap, especially when followed by an emote. Heheheha indeed. This completely goes against the card's intended purpose. It's not supposed to be a win condition. It's meant to complement spells like Zap or Log, not replace them. That's why Abdad suggested the card gets a rework, not a removal. He thinks that a good fix would be to limit where it can be placed, maybe preventing it from being dropped deep onto the enemy side. That way it can't be used purely as a tower cheese tool. And if that change is made, the devs could safely buff it in other ways, like increasing the damage amplification or simply more damage by itself. This would make it more of an interactive and fair spell to play against. Right now, it's not a terrible card, but it's in a weird spot. Not strong enough to shine consistently, yet broken enough to steal wins in frustrating ways. But maybe that's what makes the Goblin Curse so fascinating. It is a perfect example of Clash Royale's ongoing identity crisis, trying to walk that tightrope between creativity and competitiveness. On paper, the card is clever, unique, and rewarding for synergy, but in practice, it's either forgettable or frustrating. It shows how even the smartest card designs can break down when they meet real player behavior. And that's the paradox. It's not just about balance, it's how people choose to play. A card built to reward creative combos instead gets used as a surprise nuke. A support spell becomes a tower-winning win condition.
Yes! Yes, we take the win. I thought we lost there. For sure.
And while it's easy to blame the card, sometimes the real issue is how unpredictable we, the players, actually are. Whether Goblin Curse gets reworked, buffed, or fades into obscurity, one thing is for sure. It got people talking. And in a game this old, maybe that alone makes it a success. But the Goblin Curse is far from the only card to stir up controversy. If you want to dive deeper into the chaos, check out the top 11 most hated decks in Clash Royale history. A look at the strategies that made players rage, quit, or question reality. You really don't want to miss it, and I'll see you there.